All right, so here we are. We're going to be talking about section 4 of chapter 12, which is single-celled organisms, the very early ones. And uh, something that's true back in the day and is still true now is that there's a lot of single-celled organisms that are only one cell that produce a lot of oxygen for our world, right? So they live in the ocean usually, and they're prokaryotic cells, which is the earlier ones, right? The early single cells. And then protists, and there's still prokaryotic cells right now that still do this. They're photosynthetic. They take sunlight, they take in carbon dioxide, and they push out sugars. And one example is cyanobacteria. Cyan is a color. Uh, they look green. You can call them green, and your world will be fine. And they're bacteria. These aren't the ones that hurt you, though. These are just single-celled organisms without a nucleus. That's what prokaryote means. Remember, pro means before. Kary means center or nucleus in this case. And they have no organelles with membranes around them. And they put a lot of oxygen in the world. And here you see them. They're green. These are single cells. And yeah, there's evidence of them because these rocks are not rocks. These are actually dead bodies of these prokaryotes. So when the prokaryotes died, they landed on top of the rocks. They landed on top of each other and formed these rock structures called stromatolites. Endosymbiosis is kind of hard to understand. I'm going to move my head so that you can see a little better. But endosymbiosis is this idea that an organism used to live outside of something, now lives inside of something, and they work together. And the reason why it's hard to understand is because if something eats you whole, something swallows you like Pinocchio, you generally don't think of yourselves as having a partnership, right? A mutually beneficial partnership. But here we are, right? So here's a bacteria. This bacteria lived outside of a cell, came into a cell, and normally what would happen is this cell would surround it like this, surround it with its membrane, and then digest it. But for some reason, this green cell didn't do that. It brought it in, but instead of digesting it, it just kind of kept it there. And over time, they started to work together. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests this. You're like, what evidence? Well, one is this cell, this yellow one, has two membranes. Its original membrane plus the membrane it got when it came in. The proteins on the original membrane are very similar to proteins on bacteria we find today. This yellow thing, which is a mitochondria now, right, has its own DNA. And the mitochondrial DNA is similar to the original bacterial DNA. So there's a lot of evidence that's pointing to this, but this is a theory because in the end, you'd have to have been there and somehow observed this happening in order to, or recreate it in order to be able to be certain that and make this more than just a theory. Sexual reproduction is important, not just because it's fun, but because it adds a lot of genetic variation. If two organisms are successful in life, like your parents, they survived, they were successful, they were able to find each other, they did the mating thing correctly, like they were able to court each other, and then they were able to produce a live offspring, then the genetics of those successful members of the population are passed on to the next generation. And that makes a big deal over time because good genes get passed on more often. And that's it for chapter 12, section 4.